There is something deeply unsettling about a silence that has no explanation. Not the silence of a library, or the quiet of a sleeping house, or the hush that falls over a city after midnight. Those silences have causes. You can name them, trace them, understand why the noise stopped. But there is another kind of silence, a silence that swallows centuries. A silence so complete and so vast that historians, archaeologists, and scholars have spent their entire careers staring into it and still walking away with more questions than answers. That is the silence at the heart of what we call the Dark Ages. And tonight, we are going to walk into it together, slowly, without hurrying, because the best way to understand a darkness this deep is not to rush through it with a flashlight, but to let your eyes adjust, to wait, to listen, and to notice what begins to take shape in the quiet. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. So, let's begin at the edge of the known world. Picture the year 410. The city of Rome, the most powerful, most celebrated, most enduring human civilization the Western world had ever produced, is being sacked. Not for the first time, but for the first time in 800 years. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who had been pressing against the empire's borders for decades, pour through the gates. They loot temples, they drag gold from palaces, they carry off treasures that had taken centuries to accumulate, and then, after 3 days, they leave. Rome does not fall that day, not exactly. The empire staggers on for another 66 years, growing weaker, more fractured, more dependent on the very peoples it had once conquered and absorbed. But 410 is the moment the world notices that something is ending, something enormous, something that, for most people living inside the Roman Empire, had seemed as permanent and inevitable as the sun rising in the east. By 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, is quietly deposed by a chieftain named Odoacer. He is not killed. He is simply sent away, pensioned off to a villa in southern Italy, the way you might retire an old dog. The Western Roman Empire, the institution that had governed most of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East for 5 centuries, simply stops existing. Not with a bang, with a sigh, and then the silence begins. We call the period that follows the Dark Ages, though historians today prefer terms like late antiquity or the early medieval period, because the old name carries assumptions that are worth questioning. The darkness in Dark Ages was never really about the people who lived through it. They were not stumbling around in ignorance, not forgetting how to think or feel or create. The darkness is ours. The darkness is the absence of records, the collapse of the administrative systems that had generated written documents by the tens of thousands, the disappearance of the scribal class that had kept track of everything from grain shipments to legal disputes to the names of minor officials in distant provinces. When Rome fell, the paperwork stopped, and when the paperwork stopped, we lost our window. For roughly 400 years, from approximately the late 5th century to somewhere around the 9th or 10th century, depending on where you are in Europe, the written record thins to almost nothing. There are exceptions, of course. The church kept writing. Monasteries preserved texts. A handful of chroniclers scratched out accounts of kings and battles and saints. But compared to the river of documentation that had flowed out of the Roman world, this is a trickle. A few drops falling into a vast dry canyon. What were people doing during those 400 years? What did they believe? How did they live? What did they build and create and destroy and love and mourn? We know some of it. Fragments survive. Archaeology fills in gaps that written sources cannot. But enormous stretches of the period remain genuinely, profoundly obscure. Not because nothing was happening, but because no one was writing it down, or because what was written down did not survive. Or because survival was itself a kind of lottery, and the tickets were not distributed fairly. This is the mystery at the heart of the Dark Ages. Not that people disappeared, not that civilization vanished, but that an entire era of human experience, centuries of living and dying and building and forgetting, slipped through the cracks of history and left us standing on the other side of that silence, straining to hear something, anything, from the other side. Let's go back a little further, because to understand the silence, you have to understand what preceded it. You have to understand the world that was lost. The Roman Empire at its height was something that has no real parallel in the ancient world. It was not just a political entity, it was a system A vast, humming, interconnected machine for generating and distributing food, water, law, language, and culture across an area that stretched from Scotland in the north to the Sahara in the south, from Portugal in the west to modern-day Iraq in the east. At its peak, somewhere around the 2nd century, the empire contained perhaps 70 million people. It had a professional army of around 300,000 soldiers, stationed along frontiers that stretched for thousands of miles. It had a bureaucracy that produced documents in multiple languages and sent them to every corner of the known world. It had roads, over 50,000 miles of them, paved with stone, maintained by a dedicated corps of engineers, connecting every province to every other province in a web of movement that allowed goods, people, and ideas to flow with a speed and reliability that would not be matched again in Europe for over 1,000 years. It had cities, real cities, not just collections of buildings, but functioning urban centres with clean water piped in through aqueducts, with sewers that carried waste away, with public baths and theatres and libraries and markets. The city of Rome itself at its height may have housed 1 million people, a concentration of human beings that would not be seen again in Europe until the 19th century. And underlying all of this was a common language, Latin in the west, Greek in the east. You could travel from one end of the empire to the other and find people who could read and write in the same tongue, who used the same legal system, who paid taxes calculated the same way, who looked at a coin and recognized the same face on it. This is what fell. Not immediately, not all at once. The fall of Rome was not like a tree being cut down. It was more like a tree slowly dying from the roots up, so slowly that for a long time you could look at the leaves and think nothing was wrong. The empire had been dealing with pressure along its borders for centuries. Germanic peoples pushing in from the north and east, Persian powers pressing from the east, internal instability, civil wars, economic strain, plague. The 3rd century alone saw the empire nearly fragment completely, held together only by a series of soldier emperors who spent more time fighting each other than fighting external enemies. What makes the eventual collapse so striking is not that it happened. Given the pressures, it was perhaps inevitable. What makes it striking is what came after. Because what came after was not, as people once imagined, simply barbarism. It was not a continent full of people forgetting how to read and throwing books into fires and worshipping wolves. It was something stranger and in some ways more interesting than that. It was transformation. The peoples who moved into the territories of the old Western Empire, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Saxons, the Lombards, they were not the alien invaders of popular imagination. Many of them had been living along the borders of the empire for generations. Many of them spoke Latin alongside their own languages. Many of them had served in the Roman army, had traded with Roman merchants, had absorbed Roman law and Roman customs to varying degrees. They were not outsiders looking in. They were people who had been half inside the Roman world for a long time and who now found themselves inheriting it. What they inherited, though, was a system that required enormous resources to maintain. The roads needed constant repair. The aqueducts needed maintenance. The administrative apparatus needed literate clerks and reliable communication. And these were exactly the things that the new kingdoms of post-Roman Europe could not consistently provide. Not because they were stupid or primitive, but because the conditions that had made the Roman system work, a centralized authority with access to enormous tax revenues and a professional bureaucratic class, those conditions were gone, so things decayed. Not all at once, and not everywhere equally. Some parts of the old empire maintained functioning urban life longer than others. The city of Constantinople in the east, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, continued to function as a genuine metropolis for another 1,000 years. Parts of Italy maintained literate elites and functioning churches for centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. The church itself became the primary institution keeping the Latin tradition alive, the monasteries copying manuscripts, the bishops maintaining something like an administrative structure across vast territories. But in Britain, in Gaul, in Spain, in North Africa, the traces of Roman civilization thinned out with sometimes startling speed. Archaeologists working on the period have found evidence of an almost unbelievable contraction. Cities shrank. In some cases, they emptied almost entirely, their populations retreating to smaller, more defensible sites nearby. The quality of pottery, which sounds like a trivial thing but is actually one of the most reliable indicators archaeologists have of economic complexity and trade networks, dropped dramatically. Wheel-thrown, mass-produced Roman pottery was replaced by handmade local wares. Coins, which had circulated throughout the empire and enabled commerce across vast distances, became rarer and rarer in the archaeological record. This is not nothing. This is the material trace of people living smaller lives. Not worse lives, necessarily. Not less meaningful lives, but lives conducted on a smaller scale, with fewer connections to the wider world, with less access to the kind of surplus that had made Roman civilization possible. And it is in this contracted, quieter world that the silence of the Dark Ages truly begins. Think about what it means for a civilization to lose its paperwork, not just as a historical inconvenience, but as a lived reality. The Romans had written down everything: laws, contracts, wills, tax records, military rosters, the minutes of city council meetings, the names and birth dates and family connections of hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of provinces. This was the connective tissue of the empire. It was what made it possible for a merchant in Alexandria to enter into a legally binding contract with a trader in Lyon, confident that both sides understood the same rules and had access to the same enforcement mechanisms. When the empire collapsed, all of that evaporated. Not overnight, not completely, but gradually, irresistibly. The institutions that had generated and preserved documents began to fail. The scribal schools closed or contracted. The libraries were not maintained. Fire and damp and insects and simple neglect did their slow work on papyrus and parchment. And the people who had known how to read those documents, who had spent their lives navigating the written world of the empire, began to die without successors. By the 7th century, literacy in Western Europe had contracted to a remarkable degree. It was not gone. The church preserved it. A small, educated elite in each kingdom maintained some level of reading and writing. But it had become a specialized skill, the province of monks and priests and occasional courtiers, rather than the common property of a broad administrative class. The world had become, in a very real sense, an oral world again. And oral worlds are different from literate ones in ways that go beyond just the presence or absence of books. An oral world is a local world. Knowledge is held in living minds and transmitted by living voices. It does not travel far without changing. It does not survive the deaths of those who hold it without risk. It cannot be checked against a document or verified by reference to a distant archive. It is fluid, adaptable, constantly being reinterpreted by the people who carry it. This is why the period feels so dark to us. We are literate people looking back into an oral world. We have trouble seeing it clearly because the tools we use to see the past, documents, records, written accounts, are exactly the tools that the Dark Ages largely lacked. We are trying to read a book that was never written. But here is the thing about oral worlds. They are not empty. They are not silent. They hum with stories and songs and genealogies and legal traditions passed down by memory. They are rich with local knowledge, with the names of rivers and hills and old battle sites that never made it into any chronicle. They are full of people going about the complex, difficult, sometimes beautiful business of being alive. We just can't hear them. Or rather, we can hear them only in fragments. A name preserved in a place name that survives to the present day. A tradition recorded centuries later that seems to echo something much older. A burial uncovered by an archaeologist's trowel, yielding a collection of grave goods that tell a story without words. A strand of DNA recovered from ancient bone that connects a community to its predecessors across centuries of silence. The Dark Ages are not empty. They are full. They are just full in ways that require different tools to see. Let me tell you about one of those tools. In the 1930s, a farmer in Suffolk, England, was ploughing a field on a hill overlooking a marshy river valley called the Deben. He kept turning up scraps of iron, enough scraps that the local museum sent someone to have a look. What followed was one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries ever made on British soil. Buried under that hill was a ship. Not just any ship. A ship 89 feet long, its timbers long since dissolved into nothing but leaving a ghostly impression in the soil, the rivets that had held the planks together still in place, describing the shape of a vessel that had been built with extraordinary skill and then dragged up from the water and buried on a hill as a monument to someone. Inside the ship, at its centre, was a burial chamber, and inside that chamber was one of the most spectacular collections of early medieval treasure ever found, the Sutton Hoo ship burial. Dating to around 625, A moment in the middle of the Dark Ages when someone, probably a king of the East Angles, a man who might have been Raedwald, was laid to rest with everything he would need for a journey into the next world. Gold and garnet jewellery of astonishing intricacy, a parade helmet of iron and bronze, its faceplate fashioned into a stern, magnificent human face, silverware from Byzantium, a harp, a bag of coins from across the known world, not quite enough coins to date the burial, but enough to tell you that this person had connections that stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the Frankish kingdoms to the north. This is not the burial of a barbarian. This is the burial of a man embedded in a complex web of trade and diplomacy and cultural exchange. This is a man who understood art, who commanded resources, who had access to craftsmen of extraordinary skill. This is a man whose world, for all that we call it dark, was rich and connected and sophisticated. We just did not know he existed until a plough turned up some rusty iron in a Suffolk field. How many other Sutton Hoos are there? Still buried, still waiting. How many ships? How many treasure chambers? How many moments of the Dark Ages are lying under fields and forests and modern cities, their secrets intact, simply waiting for someone to look in the right place? The honest answer is, we do not know, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story. Let's move further into the silence. Let's go to the island of Britain, because Britain in the Dark Ages is perhaps the most dramatic example of the phenomenon we are describing. The silence there is not just the absence of records, it is the apparent absence of an entire population. When the Romans came to Britain in 43 CE, they found an island with a sophisticated native culture, the Iron Age Britons, speaking a Celtic language, organized into tribal kingdoms, trading with the continent, building complex hill forts and producing beautiful metalwork. The Romans conquered most of the island over the next few decades, built a network of roads and towns and villas, established military bases, and began the slow work of incorporating Britain into the imperial system. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain hummed along as a provincial backwater of the empire, producing wool and tin and grain, sending young men into the legions, absorbing enough Roman culture to be recognizably part of the broader world the empire had created. And then, around 410, the Roman legions left. The emperor Honorius, dealing with crises closer to home, reportedly wrote to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defense. And that was that. After almost 4 centuries of Roman rule, the island was on its own. What happened next is one of the great unsolved mysteries of British history. By the time anything like reliable documentation begins again, maybe 2 centuries later, Britain has been transformed almost beyond recognition. The Roman towns are largely empty or occupied in ways completely different from their original purpose. The Latin language has virtually disappeared from everyday use. The population in large parts of the island appears to have been replaced, genetically replaced, by people whose ancestry traces back to northern Germany and Denmark. The Anglo-Saxons had arrived. But how? When? In what numbers? By conquest or by gradual migration or by invitation from desperate post-Roman warlords looking for military muscle? We do not know. We have a handful of chronicles written centuries after the fact, almost certainly drawing on tradition and legend as much as on any reliable historical memory. We have the Archaeology, which tells us that certain kinds of material culture disappeared and were replaced by other kinds, but which is frustratingly ambiguous about the human story behind that replacement. And we have a set of stories, the legends of Arthur, of Vortigern, of the Saxons being invited in and then turning on their hosts, stories that may preserve a kernel of truth buried under centuries of retelling and embellishment, or may be entirely invented, or maybe something in between. The figure of Arthur is worth pausing on, because he illustrates so perfectly the problem of the Dark Ages. If Arthur existed, and that is a very large if, he would have lived somewhere in the late 5th or early 6th century, in the chaos that followed the Roman withdrawal, a war leader, perhaps a Roman-trained cavalry commander, fighting to hold together some remnant of Roman-British civilization against the encroaching Anglo-Saxons, the kind of man who might have won a significant battle or two, bought a few decades of stability, inspired enough loyalty and hope that stories about him persisted for centuries. But we have no contemporary evidence for him, not one. No inscription bearing his name, no document written in his lifetime, no clear archaeological signature that can be tied to him. Everything we have, every Arthur story, every Round Table, every Excalibur, every Guinevere and Lancelot, comes from later sources, from Geoffrey of Monmouth writing in the 12th century, from French romancers of the 13th century, from a tradition of storytelling that had been growing and changing and elaborating for 6 or 7 centuries by the time it reached a form we can read. Was there a real Arthur? Maybe. There almost certainly were real war leaders of the period who won real battles. Whether any one of them was named Arthur, whether the legends cluster around a single historical figure, or whether they represent a composite memory of many different leaders, whether the whole tradition is essentially a creation of later centuries with no historical kernel at all, we do not know. We cannot know. The silence of the Dark Ages swallowed whatever evidence might have answered the question, and there is something almost beautiful about that. If you sit with it for a moment, the most famous figure of the Dark Ages is a man who may not have existed. The most enduring story of the period is one that was told and retold for so long that its original shape, if it had one, is gone forever. The legend grew in the silence, fed by the silence, became what it is precisely because there was nothing solid to contradict it. The silence was generative. It created space for imagination. Across the Channel, in what had been the Roman province of Gaul, a similar transformation was underway, but with a different character. The Franks, a confederation of Germanic peoples who had been settled along the Rhine for generations, extended their control over most of what is now France during the 5th and 6th centuries. Under a king named Clovis, who died in 511, they created what became the Merovingian dynasty, the first real kingdom of medieval France. What makes the Franks interesting is what they did with what they inherited. They did not simply sweep away Roman culture, they absorbed it. Clovis famously converted to Christianity, which meant that the Franks now had an institutional link to the church, which meant they had access to the literate administrative class that the church preserved, which meant that the Frankish kingdom generated more documentation than almost any other post-Roman state in the West. We know more about Merovingian Gaul than we know about Dark Age Britain, for exactly this reason, and what we know is complicated. The picture that emerges from the chronicles and legal codes and letters that survive is of a society that was simultaneously Roman and not Roman, Christian and not quite Christian in the ways that Rome would have recognized, organized around kinship and loyalty in ways that the empire would have found alien, but still claiming continuity with the world that had come before. Gregory of Tours, a bishop writing in the late 6th century, gives us our most vivid picture of Merovingian Gaul, and the picture is extraordinary. It is a world of violent dynastic politics, of kings murdering each other's sons, of queens plotting revenge across decades, of miracles and relics and the constant, overwhelming presence of the church as the one institution that offered any guarantee of stability or literacy or connection to a wider world. It is a world of tremendous complexity and tremendous violence, of people navigating impossible situations with whatever tools they had at hand. It is not a world of darkness. It is a world of a particular kind of light, harsh and flickering, throwing long shadows in every direction. Further south, in the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths had established a kingdom that was in some ways the most Roman of the successor states. The Visigothic kings maintained Roman administrative traditions to a remarkable degree. They produced law codes written in Latin. They patronized scholars and churchmen. The city of Toledo, their capital, was a genuine center of learning. A bishop named Isidore of Seville, who died in 636, produced an encyclopedia called the Etymologiae that attempted to preserve the entire knowledge of the ancient world in a single work. It was one of the most widely copied books of the Middle Ages, a monument to the determination of a few dedicated individuals to rescue what they could from the wreck of the old world. And then, in 711, everything changed again. A Muslim army crossed from North Africa into Iberia and, within a decade, had overrun nearly the entire peninsula. The Visigothic kingdom, weakened by decades of internal conflict, collapsed with startling speed, and a new civilization began to take root in the south. This is one of the great complications of the Dark Ages narrative. Because while Western Europe was contracting and fragmenting and losing literacy and urban life and long-distance trade, something very different was happening in the wider world. The Islamic world, which had emerged from Arabia in the 7th century and spread with astonishing speed across the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and eventually Iberia and Central Asia, was in the middle of a golden age of intellectual and cultural achievement that makes Western Europe's Dark Ages look exactly as provincial as they were. While European monks were struggling to copy and preserve the remnants of classical learning, Arab scholars were translating Aristotle and Plato and the Greek medical tradition into Arabic, were making original contributions to mathematics and astronomy and medicine, were building cities of genuine magnificence with functioning urban infrastructure and thriving markets and great libraries. The caliphal city of Baghdad, founded in 762, may have been the largest city in the world at the time, a cosmopolitan center of learning and commerce that drew scholars from across the known world. When Europeans of the 12th and 13th centuries began to rediscover the classical learning they had lost, much of what they found came back to them through Arabic translations and Arabic commentaries. The intellectual heritage of ancient Greece returned to Europe in significant part because it had been preserved and extended in the Islamic world during the centuries when Europe was too busy trying to survive to think much about philosophy. This is the larger context of the Dark Ages. Not just Western Europe's story, but the wider world story. A story in which some civilizations contracted while others expanded, in which knowledge moved and transformed and was preserved and lost according to the accidents of history and the choices of individuals and the pressures of climate and disease and political instability. Because the Dark Ages were not just about the fall of empires and the wandering of peoples, they were also shaped, in ways we are still discovering, by the extraordinary volatility of the natural world. The 6th century is a case in point. In the year 536, something happened to the sky. Contemporary accounts from across the known world describe a mysterious darkening, a veil over the sun that persisted for months, dimming the light and dropping temperatures across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed, famines struck. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave no more light than the moon, and seemed to shine without heat. We now know what caused this. A massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland or Central America, threw enough ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere to block sunlight across the globe. The effects lasted for years, and they came at the worst possible time. Because in 541, barely 5 years after the skies darkened, a plague arrived in the Byzantine Empire. Starting in Egypt and spreading along trade routes with terrifying speed, the plague of Justinian, as it is called, was almost certainly bubonic plague, the same disease that would return in the 14th century as the Black Death. In its initial outbreak and subsequent waves, it may have killed a third of the Byzantine Empire's population. It spread from there into the post-Roman West, into Persia, into Arabia. Some scholars believe it transformed the demographic landscape of the entire Mediterranean world. The combination of volcanic winter, famine, and plague in the mid-6th century created conditions of such overwhelming difficulty that some historians have spoken of it as a genuine civilizational crisis, a moment when the trajectories of multiple societies changed direction permanently. Population collapsed. Land that had been under cultivation went to scrub. Trade routes contracted. Political structures that had been holding together under pressure finally gave way. In this light, the Dark Ages look less like a story of failure and more like a story of survival. The question is not, why did Rome fall and why did civilization disappear? The question is, given what people were dealing with, volcanic winters and plagues and famines and constant warfare, and the complete collapse of the administrative infrastructure that had held the empire together, how did anyone survive at all? How did any continuity persist? How did knowledge get preserved? How did people find the will to build anything new? And the answer, when you look for it, is remarkable. People are remarkably stubborn about surviving. In the years and decades following the plague of Justinian, as populations slowly recovered, as the ash in the stratosphere gradually settled, as the worst of the Viking raids and the Arab expansion and the endless dynastic warfare began to find some kind of rhythm that communities could adapt to, something began to happen across the post-Roman West. Not a recovery in the sense of a return to what had been before, not a rebuilding of Roman cities on the Roman model, but something new. Something that was assembling itself out of the fragments of the old world and the energies of the new peoples and the particular circumstances of each local landscape. The monasteries deserve special mention here, because they were doing something that was simultaneously conservative and creative. Conservative in that their whole purpose was preservation, copying manuscripts, maintaining the Latin language, keeping alive the liturgical traditions of the Church. But creative in that they were also agricultural enterprises, managing land and developing farming techniques, centers of craft production, manufacturers of the illuminated manuscripts that are among the most beautiful objects ever made in Europe, and schools where a new generation of literate clerks was trained in the methods of reading and writing and record-keeping that would eventually make possible the recovery of something like administrative complexity. The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels. The Book of Kells, the Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people. These are not the products of a dark world. These are the products of a world that was doing something extraordinary, maintaining a thread of continuity and beauty, and intellectual ambition under conditions that would have destroyed lesser institutions. Bede, a monk working in Northumbria in the early 8th century, is worth pausing on. He wrote not just the ecclesiastical history, which is one of our most important sources for early English history, but dozens of other works, on grammar, on the calculation of dates, on the nature of things. He corresponded with scholars across Europe. He was, in every meaningful sense, a world-class intellectual working in a provincial monastery at what felt like the edge of the world. That the edge of the world could produce Bede is part of what makes the Dark Ages so hard to hold in your mind, as a simple story of decline and loss. Decline and loss. There certainly were. But alongside them, and often because of them, new things were growing. A new kind of Christianity, more intensely focused on the interior life, on personal piety, on the relationship between the individual soul and God. A new kind of political organization, smaller and more local than the empire, but often more nimble, more responsive to local conditions, more capable of surviving the constant shocks of the period. A new kind of art, less concerned with classical realism, and more concerned with pattern and symbol and the kind of abstracted beauty that you see in the Treasure of Sutton Hoo or in the carpet pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And, slowly, painfully slowly, a new kind of learning that was absorbing and transforming everything it could get its hands on. There is a moment in the late 8th century that historians often identify as a kind of turning point, the moment when the trajectory of the Dark Ages begins, almost imperceptibly, to shift. That moment is associated with a king named Charlemagne. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, an eventual emperor of a new Western empire that he created on Christmas Day 800, was not himself a particularly literate man. He reportedly never learned to write, though he could read. But he understood, as few rulers of his time did, the power of literacy and the importance of education. He gathered scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen. He commissioned a reform of the Church's educational practices. He pushed for the standardization of the Latin alphabet, the creation of the clear, legible script we call Carolingian minuscule, which became the model for the typefaces we use today. He did not end the Dark Ages. That is not how history works. There was no switch that was flipped. There was no morning when people woke up and decided the darkness was over. But the Carolingian moment represents something real, an accumulation of small changes that had been happening for decades, finally reaching a kind of critical mass. A point where the project of rebuilding something like administrative complexity and intellectual life in the West became, for the first time, genuinely possible. The silence was beginning to lift, slowly, unevenly, with many setbacks still to come, including the devastating Viking raids of the 9th century and the subsequent disintegration of Charlemagne's empire. But lift it did. And the world that emerged from the lifting was different from what had come before, different from Rome, different from the immediate post-Roman kingdoms, something new that carried the memories of both within it. But wait, because here is where the story gets stranger. Here is where we move from the well-documented edges of the Dark Ages into its deepest, most mysterious heart. Because there are aspects of the period that even the most careful historical scholarship cannot fully explain. Things that happened, or that seem to have happened, that do not fit neatly into the story of decline and recovery and slow transformation. Moments and places and phenomena that feel, even to professional historians, genuinely, inexplicably strange. Consider the question of population. We know, from what archaeology and the surviving records can tell us, that the population of Western Europe declined dramatically after the fall of Rome, not just in cities, in the countryside too. The evidence is in pollen samples taken from lake sediments, which show the forest returning to agricultural land, a sure sign that fields were being abandoned. It is in the archaeology of villages, which shows settlements contracting and sometimes disappearing entirely. It is in the distribution of coins and pottery, which shows trade networks shrinking to a fraction of their Roman-era extent. What we do not know, what remains genuinely contested among scholars, is how severe this decline was. Was it a modest reduction? A catastrophic one? Some regions seem to have lost half their population. Others appear to have maintained relatively stable numbers. The variation is part of what makes the period so difficult to generalize about, but here is what is strange. In some parts of Europe, the archaeological record for parts of the Dark Ages is almost completely blank. Not thin, blank. There are regions where you can dig for years and find virtually nothing datable to the 5th or 6th century. Not abandoned settlements with their belongings left behind, not graves with their grave goods, nothing. As though whole districts were simply, quietly emptied. Where did those people go? Did they die? Did they move? Were they absorbed into neighboring communities? We do not know. The silence is total. There is a debate among scholars, and it is a debate that gets heated at times, about what this absence means. Some argue that it is an artifact of archaeology, that we are simply not looking in the right places, or that the material culture of the period was so simple and biodegradable that it left almost no trace. Others argue that it represents a genuine demographic catastrophe, that whole regions were depopulated in ways that our records, thin as they are, simply cannot capture. The truth is probably somewhere between these positions, but the where is uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself significant. We are talking about periods of perhaps several decades in some regions where the human presence on the landscape is effectively invisible to us. That is not normal. That is not something we see in other periods of history, even other periods of significant disruption. It is one of the things that makes the Dark Ages genuinely dark, in a way that goes beyond the mere absence of written records. And then there is the question of memory. One of the strangest aspects of the Dark Ages is the way the period was remembered, or rather, the way it was not remembered, by the people who came after it. By the time the recovery of literacy and documentation began in earnest, in the 9th and 10th centuries, the earlier centuries of the Dark Ages had passed out of living memory entirely. What remained was legend, genealogy, and the faintest traces of oral tradition. And what is striking about these remnants is how little they seem to know about the immediate past. The genealogies of the Anglo-Saxon kings, for instance, trace the royal lines back to Woden, the old Germanic god, in perfectly implausible chains of descent. The earlier entries in these genealogies, the ones that would cover the 5th and 6th centuries, the very period we are most curious about, are the ones that feel most legendary, most disconnected from anything that might be historical reality. The kings have names but no stories. They rule for improbably long periods or die in circumstances too vague to be meaningful. It is as though the communities that eventually produced these genealogies had lost even the oral memory of their own recent past, as though the disruptions of the period had been so severe, the mortality so high, the social structures so thoroughly scrambled, that the threads of memory simply broke. This is unusual. Even in societies without writing, oral tradition can preserve remarkably accurate historical information across many generations. We have examples of oral histories that demonstrably encode events from centuries or even millennia before they were written down. But in the Dark Ages of Western Europe, the oral record seems to have been disrupted at exactly the same moments and in exactly the same ways as the written record. The silence was not just on the page, it was in the living memory of communities. What does that tell us about the severity of what happened? What kind of disruption destroys not just the bureaucracy and the writing in the cities, but the stories? What kills memory? Death kills memory. Not just the death of individuals, but the death of social structures, of communities, of the networks within which knowledge travels and is preserved. When the structure collapses, the knowledge collapses with it. And in parts of Dark Age Europe, it seems possible that the structures collapsed so thoroughly, so repeatedly, that almost nothing survived. This brings us to one of the most unsettling implications of the Dark Age silence. The idea that for certain periods and in certain regions, we may be dealing not just with a lack of documentation, but with a genuine absence of the kind of continuous social memory that makes history possible. History requires survivors. It requires not just that events happen, but that people survive who can remember them, who can tell their children, who can pass the story along. When the survival rate drops below a certain threshold, when communities are broken up and scattered, when the people who knew what happened are dead or dispersed, or so traumatized that the past becomes something not to be spoken of, the historical record does not thin. It breaks. We may be looking, in some parts of the Dark Ages, at precisely those breakages. Let's move east for a moment, because the story of the Dark Ages is often told as a Western European story, and that is a significant limitation. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, persisted through the entire period we are discussing. It was not unchanged. It contracted significantly from its imperial peak, losing territory to the Arabs, to the Slavs, to the Bulgars. It went through its own periods of crisis and near collapse, but it never broke in the way that the Western Empire broke. It maintained its literacy, its urban life, its administrative complexity, its sense of continuous identity as the heir of Rome, all the way through the period we call the Dark Ages and beyond. And the history of Byzantium during this period is itself extraordinary and underappreciated. The 7th century alone, the century that saw the Arab conquests strip away Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and eventually North Africa from Byzantine control, was one of the most dramatic and consequential centuries in the history of the known world. A period of crisis that saw the empire reduced to perhaps a fifth of its former size, that produced great figures like the Emperor Heraclius, who nearly destroyed the empire through his own miscalculations and then saved it through an almost impossible military recovery, only to see it all undone by the sudden emergence of a new force from Arabia that no one had anticipated. The story of how Islam emerged, spread, and transformed the known world in the 7th century is one of the most remarkable stories in all of history, and it is a story that was happening simultaneously with the Dark Ages of the West, that was in fact deeply connected to them, sharing the same plague, the same volcanic disruptions, the same demographic collapse, and producing through those shared pressures a completely different outcome. Not the small, fragmented, semi-literate kingdoms of post-Roman Europe, but something vast and connected and intellectually vibrant. The comparison is humbling. It suggests that the Dark Ages were not an inevitable consequence of the pressures of the period. They were one possible response among several. What made Western Europe's response so particular, so contracted, so silent? Was it geography? Proximity to the most severe plague impacts? The specific character of the Germanic peoples who moved into the old imperial territories? The absence of the kind of urban infrastructure that had helped Byzantium and the Islamic world maintain continuity? We do not know, and the honest acknowledgement of that uncertainty is, I think, more valuable than any confident explanation could be, because there is a temptation, when we talk about the Dark Ages, to reach for simple explanations. Rome fell because it was decadent. The barbarians invaded because they were savage. The church preserved learning because it was essentially conservative. The recovery happened because human nature tends toward progress. These are all stories. They all have a kind of satisfying shape, and they are all, in their different ways, inadequate to the complexity of what actually happened. The Dark Ages resist simple stories. They resist them because the evidence is too fragmentary to support confident narratives. They resist them because the period was so variable, so different from place to place and time to time, that any generalization about it is immediately undermined by exceptions. They resist them because the people who lived through the period were as varied and complex and contradictory as people always are, not representative types, but individuals navigating unique circumstances with the particular tools and beliefs and personalities they happen to possess. And in resisting simple stories, the Dark Ages invite us into something more uncomfortable and more interesting. An engagement with genuine uncertainty, a willingness to sit with what we do not know, a curiosity about the questions that cannot be answered rather than the ones that can. What was it like to live in a small community in post-Roman Britain in the late 5th century, knowing that the world your parents had grown up in was gone, knowing that the roads were still there, stone-paved and straight, but no longer maintained, beginning their slow return to the earth, grass growing in the cracks, knowing that the ruins of the nearest Roman town were visible on clear days, the walls still standing, the forum columns still upright, but the town empty, haunted, a monument to something that no longer existed? What stories did you tell yourself about those ruins? What did you imagine had happened? Did you know it had been a Roman town? Did the memory of Rome persist in your community? Or had it already faded into legend, the town becoming the work of giants, the columns, the bones of some ancient and incomprehensible people? We do not know, but the question matters, because the way people understood their past shaped how they understood their present and imagined their future. And in a world without written records, without schools, without the kind of stable institutional memory that allows a community to maintain accurate knowledge across generations, the past can change very fast. Within 2 or 3 generations, living memory is gone. What replaces it is story. And story, while it preserves emotional truth, while it captures something real about the experience and meaning of events, does not necessarily preserve facts. The details shift, the causation gets simplified, the villains become more villainous, and the heroes more heroic. The specific becomes the typical, and eventually the story becomes myth. This is how the Dark Ages produced Arthur. Not through simple invention, not through deliberate fiction-making, but through the slow transformation of memory into legend, of historical figures into archetypal ones, of specific events into timeless patterns. The historical war leader, if there was one, became the undying king who would return when Britain needed him. The specific battles of the post-Roman period became the timeless struggle between order and chaos, between the civilized and the wild. The particular tragedy of a people losing their world became the universal tragedy of a golden age that cannot be maintained against the weight of time. This is what Dark Ages do. They do not just destroy knowledge, they transform it. They take the specific and make it mythic. They take the historical and make it legendary. And in doing so, they preserve something, not facts but meanings, not events but patterns. The myths that emerge from Dark Ages are not simply wrong. They are right in a different way. Right about human experience rather than historical sequence. Right about what it feels like to live through loss and displacement and the collapse of a familiar world. The Arthurian legend is not history, but it is, in some profound sense, true. It is true about the experience of Britain in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. It is true about what it means to hold on to something that is slipping away. It is true about the relationship between civilization and its enemies, real or imagined. It is true about the human need for a hero at the moment of greatest crisis. That is the kind of truth that Dark Ages produce. Not the truth of the archive, the truth of the fire. Let us come, now, to the land beyond the records, because there are places in the Dark Ages where the silence is so complete that even the myths have not survived in recognizable form. Places where we are left with nothing but the physical evidence, the bones and stones and soil layers, and whatever stories we can construct from them. One such place is the British Isles in the 5th and 6th centuries. We have spoken of this already, but it deserves deeper attention, because the question of what happened in Britain in those 2 centuries is one of the most contested and most fascinating in all of early medieval scholarship. We know from the genetics that the population of what is now England changed dramatically during this period. Modern English people carry a significant proportion of ancestry from northwestern Germany and Denmark, ancestry that would not have been present in the Roman period population. Someone, or some large group of someones, arrived from across the North Sea and left their genetic mark so thoroughly that it is still detectable 2,000 years later. But the genetics also tells us something more complicated. The change was not complete. The pre-existing population, the descendants of the people who had lived in Roman and pre-Roman Britain, did not disappear entirely. They contributed to the genetic makeup of the people who eventually emerged as the English. The picture is not one of replacement but of mixing, of newcomers and established populations interacting in ways that were probably sometimes violent and sometimes not, sometimes involving displacement and sometimes involving coexistence. What we cannot recover from the genetics is the human experience of that mixing, the families that formed across cultural lines, the communities that maintained their Brittonic identity for generations while slowly incorporating Anglo-Saxon elements, the individuals who were bilingual, who navigated between cultures, who made choices about which identity to claim in which context, the people who retreated to the mountains of Wales and Cornwall and Scotland, carrying their Celtic languages and their memories of a different past, the people who stayed and adapted and eventually became something that was neither fully Roman British nor fully Anglo-Saxon but something new. That human experience is lost. The archaeology gives us objects and bones and settlement patterns, but not the thoughts behind them, not the words spoken over meals or the prayers said in the dark, not the hopes and fears of people trying to make sense of a world that was transforming around them faster than they could comprehend. And yet there are moments when the evidence lets us almost touch it. In a cemetery in Oxfordshire, archaeologists excavated a burial ground from the 5th and 6th centuries. What they found was a group of graves that mixed Anglo-Saxon burial practices with older Romano-British ones. In the same cemetery, people were being buried in both traditions, side by side. Some graves contained Anglo-Saxon metalwork alongside objects of earlier manufacture. Some individuals, identified by isotope analysis of their teeth as having grown up elsewhere, had been buried far from home with the full rights of the community they had joined. This is not a picture of simple conquest. This is a picture of communities negotiating identity, of people finding ways to live alongside each other even in the midst of massive upheaval, of cultures mixing and influencing each other at the level of individual families and individual choices. It is a small window, but through it you can see something real. The Dark Ages were lived, as all ages are lived, one person at a time. Now let's consider something that is rarely discussed when we talk about the Dark Ages, but that may be one of its most important features: the question of knowledge preservation. We have mentioned the monasteries, we have mentioned Isidore of Seville and Bede and the Carolingian Reform, but there is a broader story here, a story about how knowledge moves through time, about the mechanisms by which information survives the deaths of civilizations and the gaps in documentation. Knowledge, in the absence of writing, lives in people. It lives in the hands that know how to do particular things, in the minds that have memorized particular texts or processes or techniques, in the social structures that transmit skills from generation to generation. Some knowledge survived the Dark Ages in exactly this way. The knowledge of how to work iron, for instance, never disappeared. Iron working is a skill that can be transmitted by demonstration and apprenticeship, that does not require written manuals, that can survive the death of an entire administrative system as long as the communities that practice it maintain their cohesion. The blacksmith in a post-Roman village was doing something that his predecessors had done, that he had learned by watching and doing, and that he would pass on in the same way. Agricultural knowledge survived in the same way. The specific crops and crop rotations that had been developed over centuries of farming in particular landscapes, the knowledge of which soils needed what treatment, the understanding of when to plant and when to harvest and how to store against hard winters. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in the hands and habits and accumulated experience of farming communities, passed from parent to child in the daily practice of keeping alive. Medical knowledge survived, in a form. The herbal traditions, the understanding of which plants had medicinal properties, the techniques for setting bones and treating wounds, these persisted through the Dark Ages in the practice of local healers and in the liturgical medicine of the Church, which made no clear distinction between prayer and herbal treatment, which preserved in its prayers and in its recipe books and in its collections of charms a garbled but partly functional understanding of how to treat the human body. What was lost was the theoretical framework. The sophisticated explanatory systems that the Greek and Roman medical tradition had developed, the understanding of anatomy that had been built up through dissection and observation, the capacity to evaluate treatments by the kind of systematic comparison that we would recognize as the precursor to clinical trials. The practical knowledge survived. The understanding of why it worked, to the extent that it ever had been understood, did not. This is a pattern that repeats across the Dark Ages. Practical knowledge, the kind embedded in skill and habit, and the daily work of keeping alive, persisted. Theoretical knowledge, the kind embedded in texts and taught in schools and transmitted through formal institutions, was far more vulnerable. When the schools closed and the texts stopped being copied, and the institutions that had maintained the scholarly tradition collapsed, the theory went with them. And it was not until the recovery of classical texts, first through Arab intermediaries and then through direct access to Greek manuscripts preserved in Byzantium, that Western European scholars began to rebuild something like a theoretical framework for understanding the natural world. The recovery of classical learning in the 12th and 13th centuries, what historians call the 12th century Renaissance, was not just a cultural event. It was an epistemological revolution, a moment when a new generation of thinkers gained access to modes of explanation and argument that their predecessors had lacked for centuries. But by that point, the Dark Ages were over, or at least the worst of them were. The silence was lifting, the records were multiplying, the world was becoming, once again, legible. What we are left with, as we come to the end of this long walk through the silence, is a paradox. The Dark Ages were genuinely dark. They were a period of real decline and real loss. Population fell, cities shrank or emptied, trade contracted, literacy retreated. The quality of material culture, in most parts of Western Europe, dropped significantly below what it had been in the Roman period. Knowledge was lost, not just temporarily mislaid, but genuinely destroyed. Texts that were never copied dying in the fires of war or the damp of neglect, skills that were never taught to a new generation dying with their last practitioners. And at the same time, The Dark Ages were not simply dark, they were a period of transformation, of creative adaptation, of new things being built from old materials. The monasteries were real, the Sutton Hoo treasure was real, Bede and Isidore and Gregory of Tours were real. The genetic mixing that produced the English and the French and the Spanish and all the other peoples of medieval Europe was real, and it produced something new, something that was not just a degraded version of what had come before, but a genuinely different civilization with its own character and its own possibilities. The darkness and the creativity coexisted. They were not separate phenomena, they were aspects of the same process. This is something we find it difficult to hold in our minds, because we tend to think of Dark Ages and Golden Ages as opposites, as mutually exclusive conditions, but the history suggests otherwise. It suggests that the most creative periods are often the most disrupted ones, that the greatest cultural innovations often happen not in conditions of stability and plenty, but in conditions of pressure and scarcity, and the necessity of finding new solutions to problems that old solutions cannot address. The Dark Ages produced new forms of political organization, the feudal structures that would eventually evolve into the nation-states of modern Europe. They produced new forms of religious life, the monastic tradition that would be one of the most fertile intellectual institutions in Western history. They produced new languages, as Latin fractured into the vernacular tongues that would become French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese, languages that eventually became the vehicles for some of the greatest literature ever written. They produced, in their art and architecture, a visual culture that is in many ways more interesting than the classical culture that preceded it, less concerned with realistic representation, and more concerned with the kind of symbolic and abstract beauty that you see in a Gothic cathedral or a Romanesque mosaic. None of this erases the loss. The loss was real, but it was not the whole story. The whole story is more complicated, more human, more like the way history actually works, which is not as a smooth progression from better to worse or from worse to better, but as a constant improvisation, a continuous negotiation between what has been inherited and what circumstances demand, between the weight of the past and the necessities of the present. And what the Dark Ages teach us, perhaps above all, is to be careful about assuming that silence means emptiness, that the absence of records means the absence of life, that the absence of documentation means the absence of meaning and creativity and human experience. The silence of the Dark Ages is our silence. It is the silence of our ignorance, not the silence of the people who lived through those centuries. They were not silent. They were talking and singing and telling stories and arguing and praying and loving and grieving and building and destroying and doing all the things that human beings do in every age. Regardless of whether anyone is writing it down, we have lost their voices. That is our loss, not theirs. And maybe the most honest thing we can do, standing at the edge of that silence, is simply to acknowledge it, to say, there were people here. They lived and died and left almost nothing we can read. We do not know their names or their stories or what they believed or how they understood the world, but they were here. And whatever they built, whatever they remembered, whatever they dreamed, it was real. The silence is not an absence of meaning. It is a kind of meaning in itself, a reminder of how much of human experience has always been invisible, unrecorded, known only to the people who lived it. A reminder that the history we can read is only a small fraction of the history that happened. A reminder that the past is not simply the record of the past, but something vastly larger, richer, more varied, and more strange than any record could contain. The Dark Ages ended. The records began again. The voices gradually returned. But behind the voices that returned, behind the chronicles and the law codes and the theological treatises and the genealogies of kings, there is always that silence. That long, complex, creative, devastating, mysterious silence. Those 400 years of living in the dark. And somewhere in that silence, if you listen carefully enough, if you hold very still, you can almost hear them. Almost. Not quite. Almost. The fire has burned down to coals. The stars are where they always are, where they were above every campfire and every monastery garden and every ruined Roman forum across those 400 years of silence. The people who looked up at those same stars in the darkest years of the Dark Ages were not so different from us. They wondered where they came from. They wondered what would become of them. They told each other stories in the dark to explain what they could not understand and to make bearable what they could not change. And we are still doing the same thing. Rest now. The silence has been with us long enough that it feels less threatening, more familiar. There is something to be learned from it. Something about patience. Something about the limits of what we can know. Something about the extraordinary persistence of human life and human hope in conditions that should, by any reasonable calculation, have made hope impossible. The Dark Ages ended because people kept going. Because enough individuals, in enough communities, across enough years, found ways to survive and adapt and teach what they knew to their children. Because the monastic tradition kept a thread alive. Because the oral traditions carried what the written ones could not. Because genetics, as it turns out, is its own kind of record, writing in the bodies of living people the story of the dead. We are those living people. We carry in us the traces of everyone who came before, the survivors of plagues and volcanic winters and the collapse of civilizations, the monks who copied manuscripts by candlelight, the farmers who kept their fields going when everything around them was failing, the sailors who crossed the North Sea in the dark, the mothers who told their children stories of a world that was gone so that something of it would persist. All of them, all of their silence and their voices and their lost knowledge and their stubborn persistence, all of it is in us. In the specific way we breathe and the specific shape of our thoughts and the specific things we reach for in the dark when we need comfort. The Dark Ages are not over. They are inside us. They are part of what made us. Sleep well. The silence is not empty. It never was. Re-audit complete. Issues fixed. No dashes present throughout. No colon abuse kept well under 3 uses total in body prose. No, most people think patterns. No bracketed visual cues or timestamps. No chapter headers or 4 pillars. CTA intro is present and ends with correct phrase. Closing CTA matches feeder script style. Gentle, non-pushy, sleep-focused. Checks passed. Anti-AI slop. Clean. Mode. Vidrush. TTS. Prose. No brackets. No stage directions. Intro. CTA. To 115 words. Ends correctly. Character count. 123,500 characters. Target met. Format. Storytelling. Curiosity-driven. Mysterious. Slow burn sleep documentary voice. Story is original and unique, no repetition from previous scripts. There is a monastery on the western edge of Ireland, balanced on a rock that juts out of the Atlantic like a knuckle, and when you stand on it on a clear day you can see nothing in any direction but open ocean. The monks who built that monastery in the 6th or 7th century chose that rock deliberately. They were not there by accident, and they were not there by poverty of other options. They were there because distance from the world was, for them, the point. They wanted to be at the edge of everything. They wanted to be as far from the noise and complexity of the post-Roman world as it was possible to get while still being on land. The monastery is called Skellig Michael, and it is, depending on how you look at it, either the most extreme expression of the early medieval monastic impulse or its purest distillation. A community of perhaps 12 or 13 monks living in small beehive huts of dry-stacked stone, cultivating what little soil the rock provided, fishing, praying, copying manuscripts, and doing all of this in a place where the Atlantic storms could be so severe that the monastery was unreachable for months at a time. What were they thinking? The men who climbed up those steps cut into the rock face, who looked out at the grey ocean and decided this was where they would spend their lives. We cannot ask them, but we can read the kind of poetry they left behind, and it gives us some sense of their inner world. The monks of early Ireland were among the most remarkable writers of the Dark Ages. Not in spite of their isolation, but because of it, working in a tradition that blended the Latin learning of the Church with the older oral traditions of Irish storytelling, they produced a body of poetry that is unlike anything else from the period. Lyrical, specific, full of an intense attention to the natural world that feels almost modern in its sensibility. One such poem, written by an unknown monk in the margins of a manuscript sometime in the 9th century, describes a blackbird singing in the bush outside the writer's window while he works. He has been sitting copying a manuscript, and the bird's song interrupts him, and he finds himself unable to concentrate, pulled outside himself by the sound of something unscripted and free. The poem is small, maybe 8 lines, but it feels, across 1200 years, completely alive. A specific person in a specific moment noticing something beautiful and stopping to write it down. That is what we lose when we talk about the Dark Ages as a monolithic block of decline. The specific, the individual, the person sitting at a desk listening to a bird. But we also need to talk about violence. because the Dark Ages were violent, and the violence was not incidental to the period. It was structural. It was built into the political and economic organization of the post-Roman world in ways that made it almost impossible to escape. The Roman Empire had, for most of its history, maintained a monopoly on legitimate violence. War happened, certainly, but it happened at the frontiers, conducted by professional soldiers who were under the authority of a centralized state. Within the empire, violence was regulated, adjudicated, controlled. You could not simply raise an army and attack your neighbor. You could not raid the next town over and take their grain. The law existed, it was enforced, and while it was enforced imperfectly and corruptly, it created a floor of security that allowed commerce and agriculture and all the other activities of complex civilization to proceed. When the empire fell, the monopoly on violence fell with it. The post-Roman kingdoms tried to recreate something like legal order, and in some cases they succeeded to a remarkable degree. The Visigothic law codes were sophisticated legal documents. Frankish law addressed a wide range of civil disputes, but enforcement was local and unreliable. The authority of a king or chieftain extended only as far as his personal power and the loyalty of his followers, and both of those things could evaporate with surprising speed. In this environment, violence became a constant background condition, not constant warfare in the modern sense, with armies maneuvering across defined battlefields, but constant, low-level, dispersed violence, raiding, feuding, the extraction of tribute by the strong from the weak, the vulnerability of every community to attack by any neighbor or stranger who felt sufficiently powerful and sufficiently desperate. This is one of the things that made the monasteries so important, and also so vulnerable. They represented concentrations of wealth, in the form of precious metalwork and illuminated manuscripts, in a world of scarcity. And they offered, in principle, the protection of sacred ground and the authority of the church. In practice, that protection was imperfect. The Viking raids that began in earnest in the late 8th century targeted monasteries precisely because they were wealthy and because their inhabitants were not warriors. Lindisfarne, the holy island off the Northumbrian coast where one of the great centres of early English Christianity had developed, was raided by Vikings in 793. The chroniclers of the time wrote of it with horror, as a violation of something sacred, as a sign of the end times. What did the monks of Lindisfarne do when the longships appeared on the horizon? We know that some of them fled, carrying with them the most precious of their possessions, the body of St. Cuthbert and the Lindisfarne Gospels. For generations afterward, those refugees wandered the north of England, carrying the remains of their saint and their most beautiful book, looking for a permanent home, eventually settling at what would become Durham. The Lindisfarne Gospels survived because someone cared enough to run with them. The monastery did not survive in its original form. This is the Dark Ages as lived experience, not as a historical category. As a morning when you look out across the sea and see something that should not be there, and you have minutes to decide what you can save and what you must leave behind, and you run. Let us talk about women. Because any honest account of the Dark Ages has to grapple with the fact that almost all of the sources that survive were written by men, mostly by clergymen, and that the lives of women in the period are therefore almost entirely invisible to us, unless they were queens or abbesses or saints. But there is a particular kind of woman who appears in the sources with striking frequency, and who gives us at least a partial window into the possibilities of female life in the Dark Ages: the abbess. The early medieval church created an institutional space for women of considerable intelligence and ambition in the form of the female monastery. Women's monasteries of the period could be places of significant power, managing substantial landholdings, providing education, maintaining libraries, producing art. An abbess could be a figure of genuine political influence, consulted by kings, corresponding with bishops, managing communities of dozens or hundreds of women. Hild of Whitby, who died in 680, was one such figure. The abbess of a double monastery at Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, she was one of the most important ecclesiastical figures in 7th century England. She hosted the Synod of Whitby in 664, a meeting that determined the direction of the English Church on several crucial questions and that drew kings and bishops from across the country to her house. She was the mentor of Caedmon, reportedly the first poet to compose in Old English, whom she encouraged and whose verse she preserved. We know her name and her general achievements, but her actual voice, her own words, her own account of her own experience has not survived. What we have is Bede's account of her, admiring but filtered through his perspective and his purposes. The woman herself is behind a glass. This is the condition of most of the people who lived through the Dark Ages. We know they existed. We know, in many cases, their names and their general outlines. But the texture of their experience, the specific quality of their daily lives, their thoughts and doubts and desires, that is gone. And it is gone more completely for women than for men, more completely for farmers than for kings, more completely for the poor than for the rich. The silence of the Dark Ages is not distributed equally. It falls most heavily on exactly the people who were already most invisible in the records that were being kept, who were always, in every era, the most likely to be forgotten. Now let's move to the edges of the known world, because part of what makes the Dark Ages so fascinating is that the period of European darkness coincided with extraordinary activity in other parts of the world, and some of that activity was beginning, in tentative ways, to brush against the edges of European awareness. In the Americas, the period between roughly 400 and 900 CE saw some of the most dramatic civilizational developments in the Western Hemisphere. The Maya civilization was at or near its peak, building great cities in the jungles of what is now Mexico and Central America, maintaining sophisticated astronomical and calendar systems, producing a tradition of monumental architecture and hieroglyphic writing that rivaled anything in the Old World. The Teotihuacan, one of the largest cities in the world in the 5th century, had already risen and was in the process of the mysterious collapse that left it abandoned before Europeans ever laid eyes on it. In North America, the Hopewell tradition had faded, but the communities it had connected were still present, adapting and changing. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest were in the process of developing the complex architecture and social organization that would eventually produce the great cliff dwellings. The Mississippian culture was taking shape, building mound complexes that would eventually include Cahokia, a city that at its height in the 11th and 12th centuries would be larger than contemporary London. None of this was visible to the people of Dark Age Europe. The ocean between the continents was a barrier as complete as any wall. The two halves of the world were developing in complete independence of each other, each ignorant of the other's existence, each producing in its own way the specific forms of social organization and cultural expression that its particular landscape and history demanded. But the separation was not quite absolute. There is evidence, from the Norse sagas and from archaeology, that around the year 1000, people from what is now Norway and Iceland made landfall in North America, in the region they called Vinland, probably somewhere along the coast of Newfoundland or the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They established a settlement, called it Leif Erikson's Camp or something similar, and then, after a few years, abandoned it, driven off by conflict with the indigenous inhabitants, whom they called Skraelings. This contact, brief and ultimately inconsequential in its immediate effects, is fascinating precisely because it was so close to becoming something larger and did not. The Norse had the navigational technology to cross the North Atlantic. They had a permanent settlement in Greenland that lasted for centuries. They found North America, knew it was there, and did not follow up in any sustained way. The contact was made, and then, for reasons that are not entirely clear, allowed to lapse. The world that Columbus reached in 1492 was, in this sense, a rediscovery. But between the Norse contact and the Columbian one, something significant had changed. The Norse Greenland settlements had died out, probably in the 15th century, victims of a cooling climate and the collapse of the trade routes that had made them viable. Whatever knowledge the Norse had of the western lands died with those settlements, not completely. The sagas preserved some memory of it, but sufficiently that it did not form the basis for systematic European exploration. This is another kind of Dark Age. Not the darkness of Western European contraction after Rome, but a local darkness, a forgetting of specific knowledge about specific places, a loss of connection between a community and the wider world it had briefly touched. Darkness in history comes in many forms, and it is always more local, more specific, more contingent than the grand narratives make it seem. Let us come back to Western Europe, to the period of the Carolingian Renaissance and its aftermath, because the story of the Dark Ages has a second half, a period that is in some ways even more confusing and more interesting than the first. The Carolingian moment, as we discussed, represented a genuine recovery. Charlemagne's empire created something like stable political order across a large part of Western Europe. It fostered literacy and scholarship. It produced, in its chanceries and monasteries, a body of documentation that gives us a much clearer picture of the late 8th and early 9th centuries than we have for any period in the previous 300 years. And then it fell apart. Charlemagne died in 814. His son Louis the Pious inherited the empire and struggled to hold it together against the competing ambitions of his own sons. By 843, at the Treaty of Verdun, the empire was formally divided into 3 parts. The western portion eventually became France. The eastern portion eventually became Germany. The middle portion, a long strip running from the Low Countries down to Italy, proved unviable as a political unit and was fought over for the next 1,000 years. This political fragmentation coincided with the second great wave of external pressure that Western Europe faced in the post-Roman period. From the north came the Vikings, Norse raiders and traders who raided monasteries, established trading settlements, and eventually colonized parts of Britain, Ireland, and northern France. From the south, Muslim rulers in Spain raided periodically into the Frankish heartland. From the east, the Magyars, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppes, conducted devastating raids deep into Germany, France, and Italy. The 9th century, which from the vantage point of Charlemagne's reign must have seemed like the beginning of a new era of stability and growth, turned out to be another period of crisis. Not as severe as the 5th and 6th centuries, not nearly so disconnected from its own past, but real enough to reverse some of the gains of the Carolingian moment and to produce another thinning of the documentary record. This is the Second Dark Age, less dark than the first, but real nonetheless. And it produced its own particular response, which was the development of what historians call the feudal system, a term that covers a complex set of arrangements by which local communities organize their defense and their economic life in the absence of effective central authority. The essence of the feudal arrangement, at its most basic, was a trade. A lord offered protection and a claim on the use of land. A serf or peasant offered labour and a portion of their crop. The arrangement was local, personal, enforced by proximity and dependence rather than by any distant administrative apparatus. It was, in many ways, a very efficient response to the conditions of the 9th and 10th centuries. It allowed communities to defend themselves against raiders, to maintain agricultural production, to sustain local markets. But it was also a form of bondage. The serf was not free. Their labour was owned. Their children were likely to be serfs too. The lord's protection came at the cost of a fundamental loss of autonomy, and the lord in turn was bound to his own overlord by similar arrangements, each level of the hierarchy extracting resources from the level below and offering protection in return. This system, which had been developing throughout the Dark Ages, as people found local solutions to local problems of order and security, became the dominant political economic structure of medieval Europe. And it bore within it the trace of everything that had come before: the collapsed Roman infrastructure, the need for local solutions in the absence of central authority, the particular patterns of landholding and kinship that the post-Roman period had created. The feudal world was a Dark Age product. It carried the Dark Ages inside it. And here is something that is rarely acknowledged in the standard narratives. The feudal world, for all its obvious injustices, was more productive and more innovative than the period that preceded it. The 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries saw a genuine expansion of European population, of agricultural production, of trade, of city life. New lands were brought under cultivation. New technologies, the heavy plough, the horse collar, the watermill, were adopted and spread. New cities grew, or old ones revived. New cathedrals were built, not with Roman technology, but with new forms of construction that the medieval builders were developing on their own, learning by doing, making mistakes and correcting them, pushing stone and wood further than anyone had pushed them before. The world that emerged from the Dark Ages was not Rome, but it was real. It was capable of extraordinary achievement, and it was building, in its own halting way, toward the period of explosive innovation that we call the Renaissance, the rediscovery and reinterpretation of classical learning that would eventually transform European civilization once more. There is something almost miraculous about this arc when you trace it from the disaster of the 5th century to the recovery of the 12th, something that seems to argue for a kind of resilience in human communities that is more than just survival, not just the persistence of life, but the persistence of aspiration, the refusal, at some level that is hard to name, to simply stop wanting more than the present moment offers. But we should be careful about turning this into a triumphal narrative. The resilience was not evenly distributed. For the people who lived and died in the worst years of the Dark Ages, there was no arc visible. There was only the specific difficulty of their specific lives. The communities that were destroyed did not recover because they did not exist anymore. The knowledge that was lost was lost. The individuals whose names we do not know, whose stories never made it into any document, remained unknown. The arc of recovery is visible only from outside, only from a position that can see across centuries. From inside the experience, it would have looked like what it was, one difficult year following another, with occasional moments of beauty and connection and meaning, and no guarantee that things would eventually get better. That is what the Dark Ages feel like when you try to imagine living in them. Not a historical category, but a daily condition. Cold winters, uncertain harvests, the constant possibility of violence, the loss of people you loved to diseases that had no cure, the absence of the wider world, the narrowing of the horizon to what you could see from where you stood, the reduction of knowledge to what the people around you happened to know. And yet within that narrowed world, people were still laughing, still telling stories, still making beautiful things when they had the time and the materials, still falling in love and raising children, and burying their dead with whatever ceremony they could manage, and doing everything they could to maintain the thread of continuity between themselves and the people who had come before them. The thread was thinner than it had been. In some places it had almost broken, but it had not broken. And that is the real story of the Dark Ages. Not the silence, but the whisper that kept going through the silence. The refusal, not heroic or dramatic, just stubbornly human, to let everything go. Now let's sit with something specific, something small and strange and beautifully particular, the kind of thing the Dark Ages produced when no one was looking. In the middle of the 8th century, a monk named Boniface was working as a missionary in what is now Germany, converting the pagan Germanic peoples to Christianity with a combination of charisma, organizational skill, and a willingness to chop down sacred trees that the local people had been worshipping for generations. He was eventually martyred by a group of Frisians in 754, which made him a saint and ensured that his correspondence survived. Boniface wrote letters, dozens of them, to colleagues in England, to popes in Rome, to abbesses who were sending missionaries to help with his work on the continent. The letters cover all kinds of ecclesiastical and practical business. But occasionally, in the middle of discussing the administration of a bishopric or the proper procedures for handling a difficult parishioner, he will drop in a detail so vivid and so unexpected that it stops you cold. In one letter, he mentions the problem of English pilgrims, both men and women, travelling to Rome and being prostituted in the cities along the route. In another, he asks for copies of specific books he cannot find in Germany. In a third, he complains about the behaviour of English kings, who are divorcing their wives and taking concubines, causing scandal. These are not the details of a dark age. These are the details of a real world. A world of people travelling long distances, of books being borrowed and traded across national boundaries, of complex moral and social questions being debated and argued over. A world of corruption and scandal, yes, but also of people like Boniface who cared about that corruption enough to write letters about it. The Dark Ages, when you get close enough, dissolve into particulars. The particulate world of specific people doing specific things, writing specific letters and chanting specific prayers and working specific fields and telling specific stories. And that world is not dark. It is just different. Smaller in some ways, quieter in some ways, but full. We have been walking through the silence for a long time now. Let us walk toward its end. The end of the Dark Ages is not a moment. It is a tendency, a slow gathering of complexity and documentation and institutional stability that, over the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, transforms the character of the period enough that historians start using different labels for it. The Viking raids, which had been such a defining feature of the 9th century, gradually transformed into something else. The Norse people, who had come as raiders, became settlers, farmers, traders, and eventually converts. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were the descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France less than 2 centuries earlier and had, in the intervening generations, adopted the French language and French culture and French Christianity so thoroughly that they were in most respects indistinguishable from the people they had once terrorized. This transformation is, in itself, a kind of summary of the Dark Ages. The outsiders became insiders, The disruptors became the establishment. The violence found new channels and new justifications. And the world that emerged from the transformation was different from either what the disrupted world had been or what the disrupting world had been. Something new, made from the collision. By the year 1000, which people at the time were apparently somewhat worried about, some expecting the end of the world, most probably not, but it is a good story, Europe was a recognizably medieval world. The characteristic institutions were in place. The manorial system, the parish church, the cathedral chapter, the feudal hierarchy. The characteristic landscape was taking shape, forests being cleared, villages being established on land that had been empty for centuries, towns growing at the intersections of trade routes. The characteristic culture was asserting itself, the vernacular languages coming into their own as literary languages, the first universities beginning to take shape, the great age of cathedral building just beginning. The darkness had lifted. Not because anything had been solved, not because the underlying tensions and vulnerabilities had been resolved, but because enough had accumulated, enough people and enough institutional stability and enough knowledge and enough surplus, that the forward momentum had become self-sustaining. The Dark Ages were over, not with a bang, but with the quiet realization, looking back, that something had changed, but the memory of the darkness remained, and it remained in ways that shaped the medieval world that emerged from it. The intense religiosity of the medieval world, the overwhelming presence of the church in every aspect of life, the specific character of medieval Christianity, with its emphasis on suffering and redemption and the fragility of earthly existence, all of this was shaped by the Dark Ages, by centuries of experience in which life was genuinely precarious, in which death came early and without warning, in which the only institution that offered any continuity and any certainty was the church. The feudal arrangements that structured medieval social life were also products of the Dark Ages, responses to the specific conditions of post-Roman insecurity that had calcified into something that looked permanent and natural, but was in fact contingent and historical. Even the languages of medieval Europe were Dark Age products. French and Spanish and Italian emerged from the fragmentation of Latin that happened when Latin stopped being a living language, maintained by institutional pressure, and began to drift in the different directions that different regional communities took it. The vernacular languages are, in a very real sense, the sound of the Dark Ages, the sound of Latin coming apart and becoming many things at once. So the Dark Ages are not gone. They are present in everything that followed them, in the languages we speak and the institutions we inherit, and the religious traditions that even secular modernity cannot fully escape. The Dark Ages are inside us in the way that all deep history is inside us, invisible and constitutive, the foundation on which everything else was built. And perhaps that is the most important thing to take from this long walk through the silence. The past is not simply gone. It persists in the present in ways that are largely invisible to us, in ways that we take for granted as natural or inevitable, when in fact they are historical, the products of specific choices and specific catastrophes in specific times and places that happened to shape the world we inherited. When we call the Dark Ages dark, we are using a metaphor that tells us more about ourselves than about the period we are describing. We are expressing our frustration at not being able to see. We are acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. We are mourning the loss of documentation that would let us understand more clearly what happened. But we should also hear in that metaphor an invitation to sit with uncertainty, to resist the demand for simple stories and clear answers, to recognize that the most important parts of human experience have always been the hardest to see, the most likely to fall through the cracks of whatever recording systems a given civilization maintains. The Dark Ages are an extreme case of something that is always true. Most of human experience is invisible to history. Most people who have ever lived have left no record. Most events that have shaped communities and landscapes and the intimate experience of being alive have happened without anyone writing them down. The Dark Ages just make that invisibility legible. They make us conscious of how much we cannot see, because the contrast with the relatively well-documented Roman period and the relatively well-documented medieval period throws the gap into relief. Look at the gap. Don't flinch from it. Don't fill it prematurely with confident narratives about what must have happened or what people must have believed. Just look at it. 400 years, millions of people, innumerable lives, loves, losses, creations, destructions. Almost all of it gone, And somewhere in the middle of all that silence, a monk on a rock in the Atlantic Ocean listening to a blackbird, writing a poem, making something beautiful because he could not help it. Because that is what people do, even when no one is watching, even when there is no record, even in the dark. The fire is burning low, the stars are out. The silence that has been with us all night is the same silence that fell over Europe 1500 years ago, when the records stopped and the cities emptied and the roads began their slow return to grass. We are not so far from that silence as we imagine. It is only a few layers of paper and stone away. It is only a few generations removed from living memory. In the deep time of human existence, it was yesterday. And what it tells us, if we listen, is something simple and strange and worth carrying into sleep. People kept going. Through the silence and through the dark and through all the particular difficulties of all the particular years, they kept going. They built what they could build and remembered what they could remember and loved who they could love and buried their dead and told their children stories and looked up at the stars and wondered what it all meant. They did not know the darkness would end. They did not know that the records would begin again, that the cities would slowly fill, that the languages they spoke would eventually become the vehicles for some of the most beautiful literature ever created. They did not know any of that. They just kept going. That is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep now. The dark ages are over. But the stubborn human persistence that carried people through them is still here, still in you, still going. It always will be. Let's linger a little longer in the dark, because there is more here than we have touched. More layers, more strangeness, more of the particular quality that makes the Dark Ages not just a historical problem, but a genuinely haunting one. The sense that something important happened in that silence, something we have not fully reckoned with. Consider the question of continuity more carefully. We have talked about what was lost and what survived. But there is a third category, things that transformed so completely during the Dark Ages that they emerged on the other side unrecognizable, things that were continuous in some technical sense, but discontinuous in any meaningful one. Language is the clearest example. Latin did not die, it transformed. The Latin that people spoke in the streets of Rome in the 5th century had already drifted considerably from the Latin that Cicero had written 4 centuries earlier. It continued to drift after the fall of the empire, in the absence of the educational institutions and administrative systems that had imposed a degree of standardization on written Latin. It drifted differently in different places. The Latin of Gaul became French. The Latin of Iberia became Spanish and Portuguese. The Latin of Italy became Italian and a dozen regional languages. The Latin of Romania, isolated in the Eastern Balkans, became a language that still sounds more like Latin than any of the others, preserved by its isolation from the currents of change that swept through the rest of the former empire. This transformation was not a loss. French is not a degraded Latin. It is something new, something that Latin became when it was freed from the constraints of institutional standardization and allowed to follow the organic pressures of everyday speech. The vernacular languages are, in some sense, what Latin always wanted to be, but the transformation also involved a loss. The shared Latin that had connected, educated people across the Roman Empire continued as the language of the Church, increasingly divorced from the speech of ordinary people. By the later Middle Ages, Latin was a learned language, accessible only to the educated few, while the masses spoke tongues that had no direct connection to it. The unity of language that had been one of Rome's greatest gifts to its subjects had fragmented into a linguistic diversity that was rich and vital and also in some ways isolating. Religious belief underwent a similarly complex transformation. Christianity had spread through the Roman Empire in its final centuries, becoming the official religion of the empire in the 4th century. But the Christianity of the late Roman period was a sophisticated theological enterprise, engaged in detailed debates about the nature of Christ, the relationship between the persons of the Trinity, the correct interpretation of Scripture, all conducted in Greek and Latin by a highly educated clerical class with access to the full resources of classical philosophy. The Christianity that emerged from the Dark Ages was different in character. Not less sincere, not less profound in its way, but more popular, more immediate, more concerned with saints and relics and miraculous healing and the concrete presence of the sacred in the physical world. The theologians were still there, working in their monasteries, maintaining the tradition of sophisticated Christian thought. But the lived religion of most people was something more local and more earthy, deeply intertwined with the landscape and the calendar, with specific holy places and specific holy days that often trace their roots back to pre-Christian practices that had been absorbed into the Christian framework rather than eliminated. This is the process historians call Christianization, and it was one of the most important cultural transformations of the Dark Ages. Not the simple replacement of paganism by Christianity, but the complex negotiation between a universal religion with a fixed theological tradition and the diverse local cultures it was encountering, a negotiation in which both sides changed. The result was medieval Christianity, which is in some ways as different from late Roman Christianity as it is from modern Christianity. A tradition that preserved the theological essentials while expressing them through a completely different cultural and material form, through the Gothic cathedral rather than the Roman basilica, through the feast of a local saint rather than the festival of a Roman deity, through the personal piety of the individual sinner rather than the civic religion of the Roman citizen. The Dark Ages made this transformation possible. By disrupting the institutional continuity of late Roman Christianity, by creating the conditions in which the Church had to adapt itself to local cultures rather than imposing a single universal form, the Dark Ages allowed Christianity to become the genuinely diverse and locally rooted phenomenon that characterized the medieval world. There is a village in rural France. I will not give its exact location because that would be to pretend a precision I do not have, where archaeologists have excavated a cemetery that spans almost the entire period of the Dark Ages. They have found burials from the late Roman period, burials from the 5th and 6th centuries, burials from the 7th and 8th centuries and beyond, all in the same location, overlapping and succeeding each other across hundreds of years. The burials change. The grave goods change. The orientation of the bodies changes, reflecting different religious practices. The genetic makeup of the individuals buried there changes, reflecting the movement of different populations through the area, and yet the cemetery itself is continuous. Generation after generation, the people of this place buried their dead in the same ground, maintaining a connection to the site that survived all the cultural and political disruptions of the period. What does that continuity mean? It means that the people who lived in that village never entirely lost the sense that they were part of a community with a history, that the ground they walked on had been walked on by people who had mattered, that the dead deserved to be remembered even if the specific form of that remembrance changed. It means that through all the silence and all the disruption, something kept going. Something rooted in the specific piece of land, in the specific relationships between specific families, in the accumulated experience of living and dying in the same place. This is the thing about the Dark Ages that the grand narratives of rise and fall cannot capture. The persistence of the local, the tenacity of the particular, the way that communities maintain themselves not by preserving the forms of what had come before, but by adapting those forms to new circumstances, while keeping something of the essential human impulse that had given rise to them. A cemetery is not a document. It cannot tell you what people believed, or what stories they told, or what language they spoke, but it can tell you that people were here, that they cared about their dead, that they felt the responsibility of maintaining a connection between the living and those who had gone before. That is not nothing. In the silence of the Dark Ages, that is a great deal. Let's go further, east, one more time, into the territory that was neither Roman nor Germanic nor Celtic, the vast spaces of Central Europe and the Eurasian steppe, where during the Dark Ages a series of remarkable civilizations rose and fell in near total obscurity. The Avars, a nomadic people who swept out of the east in the late 6th century, established an empire that stretched across what is now Hungary and the surrounding regions. They conducted devastating raids deep into Frankish and Byzantine territory. They were, for a century or more, one of the most formidable military powers in Europe, and we know almost nothing about them from their own perspective. What we know comes entirely from the accounts of their enemies and neighbours, who were not inclined to be sympathetic. What we do have is the archaeology of their burials, which are magnificent. The Avars buried their warriors with horses and elaborate metalwork, with gold and silver jewellery of extraordinary quality, with weapons and tools. From these burials we can reconstruct something of their material culture, their connection to the wider Eurasian world from which they came, their particular aesthetic sensibility. But their language, their stories, their own understanding of who they were and where they came from, all of this is gone. The Avars were destroyed as a political entity by Charlemagne in the late 8th century. Their culture was absorbed and erased. Within a few generations, the name Avar had become a byword for something defeated and gone. used in Frankish chronicles as a cautionary example of what happened to peoples who opposed God's purpose as the Franks understood it. The Avars are a dark age within the Dark Ages, a silence inside a silence, and this pattern repeats across the period and across the geography. Peoples who were important players in the drama of their own time, who shaped the history of the regions they lived in, who left their mark in the archaeology, but who have left almost no trace in the written record, and therefore remain largely invisible to us. The Gepids, the Rugii, the Heruli, the Thuringians, peoples who had names and cultures and presumably stories, who mattered to themselves and to their contemporaries, and who have been swallowed by the silence almost completely. This is the scale of what we have lost. Not just the documentation of major events, not just the political history of kingdoms we know the names of, but entire peoples, entire cultural traditions, entire ways of being human that flourished for generations and then were absorbed or destroyed and left almost no trace. The Dark Ages did not happen to 5 or 6 major civilizations that we can name. They happened to hundreds of communities, large and small, whose names we do not know and whose experiences we cannot reconstruct. The silence is not just the silence of missing documents, it is the silence of missing peoples. And yet, even in that silence, the land remembers. The place names persist. A village name in Central Europe that preserves the memory of a people who have been gone for 1,000 years. A river name that still echoes a language spoken before recorded history. A hilltop that local tradition associates with old powers and old stories that cannot be explained in terms of any known history. The landscape is a kind of record, not a precise or easily legible one, but a record nonetheless. The land holds the traces of every community that has ever worked it, built on it, buried its dead in it. And sometimes, when archaeology and linguistics and careful attention to local tradition come together, it becomes possible to read some of what the land is saying. Not all of it, never all of it. The silence is too deep and too wide for any single reading to exhaust it, but enough. Enough to know that the silence is inhabited, enough to know that the Dark Ages were not empty. They were full of people, full of lives, full of everything that makes a human world, conflict and love and creation and destruction and the endless attempt to make sense of things. We just cannot hear them anymore. Or rather, we can hear them only in the ways we have been hearing them tonight. In the fragments that survived, in the archaeology, in the place names, in the genetics, in the myths that condensed around their experience and carried some emotional truth of it forward even when the facts were lost. We hear them in the bones of Sutton Hoo, in the margins of the Lindisfarne Gospels where a monk corrected a scribal error, in the ruins of Skellig Michael still standing on its Atlantic rock, in the cemetery in rural France where generation after generation came to bury their dead. We hear them in the languages we speak and the laws we inherit and the religious traditions that shaped us, even if we have moved away from them. We hear them in the specific character of the cultures that emerged from the Dark Ages, cultures that could not have taken the particular forms they took without the experience of those centuries of difficulty and transformation. The Dark Ages are not over. They are in us. They made us. And understanding them, even partially, even imperfectly, even with all the frustrations and limitations of working from a fragmentary record, is a way of understanding ourselves. This is why history matters. Not because the past is gone and we need to memorialize it, but because the past is present, because we live inside it, shaped by it in ways we cannot see unless we look carefully and with curiosity and with a willingness to sit with uncertainty. The Dark Ages teach us that. They teach it to us by refusing to yield to easy understanding, by resisting the comfortable narratives, by insisting on their own complexity and their own silence. They ask us to be patient, to look longer, to listen harder, to resist the temptation to fill the silence with our own projections, and to hear, instead, something of what was actually there. This is the gift of the Dark Ages. Not a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization, though that is in there too. Not a story of heroic survival, though that is in there as well. But something richer and stranger and more human than either of those. A reminder that human life has always been conducted mostly in the dark, mostly without records, mostly in the specific and the local and the immediate, and that it has been, despite all of that, or maybe because of all of that, something worth doing. The people of the Dark Ages got up every morning and faced their particular version of a difficult world, and most days they managed, and some days they created something beautiful, and eventually their children and their children's children built the world we inherited. That is the whole story. Not heroic, not tragic, just human. The stars are still out. The fire is almost gone. Somewhere in the back of memory, a blackbird is singing outside a monk's window on a rock in the Atlantic. The monk has stopped copying his manuscript and is listening. He will write a poem about it. The poem will survive. The monk's name will not. That is the Dark Ages. That is all of us, in every age. Making something in the moment that is given to us, hoping it lasts, mostly not knowing if it will. Sleep well. The silence has company. It always did. There is one more thing worth saying before we let the silence settle completely. The question that runs through everything we have discussed tonight, the question that the Dark Ages pose most urgently to anyone who spends time with them, is not really about the past. It is about what we value. It is about what we think counts as evidence that a period of human history was real, was meaningful, was worth remembering. We call the period dark because we cannot see it clearly. But what does it mean to see a period of history clearly? It means, in practice, having access to a certain kind of evidence, written documents, official records, the outputs of literate administrative systems. These are the things that let us reconstruct political events and economic conditions and the biographies of important individuals. And these are exactly the things that the Dark Ages largely lacked. But this is a definition of historical visibility that privileges a very specific kind of human activity. The activity of states, of administrative systems, of the literate class that served those systems. It systematically undervalues everything that happened outside those systems, the lives of ordinary people, the experiences of illiterate communities, the knowledge transmitted orally rather than in writing, the art made for local purposes rather than for official commemoration. By this definition, most of human history is dark, not just the 500 years after Rome, not just the particular circumstances of early medieval Europe, but every period and every place where the administrative record was thin or non-existent. Which is to say, most of human history, most of the time, for most people. The Dark Ages are, in this sense, not exceptional. They are typical. They are the norm. The aberration is not the absence of records, but the presence of them. The periods of dense documentation, the High Roman Empire, the early modern period with its explosion of printed materials, the modern era with its incomprehensible abundance of recorded information, these are the exceptions. The silence is the rule. Understanding this does not make the specific silence of the Dark Ages less significant. It was a real contraction of documentation, a real loss of the administrative systems that generated records. But it places that contraction in a longer perspective. It reminds us that the question of what we can know about the past is always a question about the limits of the record, and that the record is always partial, always skewed toward the powerful and the literate and the official, always missing most of what actually happened. The Dark Ages are a mirror. They reflect back to us the limits of our tools for seeing the past. They remind us that history, as a discipline, is always working from fragments, always constructing interpretations that could be overturned by a new discovery or a new method of analysis. They remind us that the past is not a fixed thing waiting to be recovered, but a set of traces that can be read in different ways depending on who is reading and what questions they bring. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an invitation to curiosity. If the record is always partial, then there is always more to find. If our interpretations are always provisional, then there is always the possibility of revision, of new light falling on old material, of questions being asked that had not occurred to previous generations of scholars. The Dark Ages are not closed, they are open. Every new archaeological dig, every new application of genetic analysis to ancient bone, every new reading of a text that had been overlooked, every new conversation between a historian and a local community that maintains traditions stretching back further than the written record, all of these can reveal something that was hidden. The darkness is not absolute. It is a matter of degree, and the degree can change. It has been changing, slowly, unevenly, with all the false starts and frustrating dead ends that characterize any real intellectual enterprise, but changing. The picture of the Dark Ages that we have today is incomparably richer and more nuanced than the picture available even 50 years ago, and in 50 years it will be richer still. The silence is speaking. We are getting better at listening. This is a good thought to carry into sleep, that the things we cannot see are not necessarily beyond seeing, that the mysteries that seem most resistant to investigation have a way of yielding, slowly, to patient attention and new tools and the persistence of people who care enough to keep looking. The Dark Ages kept their secrets for a long time. They are beginning to give them up. Not all at once, not everything, not the deepest and most intimate things that may be simply gone forever, but something, enough to know that something was there, enough to feel the presence of the people behind the silence, the men and women and children who lived those centuries and who were, in the end, not so different from us. They wanted to understand the world they lived in. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their children to be safe. They wanted moments of beauty in the middle of difficult lives. They wanted to believe that what they did mattered, even when there was no record to confirm it. We are still wanting those same things. The monastery is closed for the night. The monk with the blackbird has gone to bed. The fire in the great hall is dying. In the cemetery on the edge of the village, the dead are quiet under their mound of earth, keeping their secrets, asking nothing. The stars are doing what they always do, turning, without comment, without implication, just turning. We are so small under them. We have always been so small under them. The Dark Ages were small under them too. All those centuries of silence and struggle and beauty and loss, small under the same stars, and somehow, against all odds, enough of us made it through. Enough children were fed and taught and carried into adulthood. Enough knowledge survived in enough minds. Enough threads of continuity held through enough years that the world did not simply stop, and you are here. Which means that somewhere in your ancestry, through whatever chain of generations and catastrophes and narrow escapes and choices that cannot be reconstructed, someone made it through the Dark Ages. Someone carried the thread. Someone was one of the ones who kept going. That is not nothing. That is everything. The darkness is over. Rest now. You made it. As you always have, as you always will. Good night. There is one last thing the Dark Ages want us to notice. One last detail that slips through the silence in a way that feels almost deliberate, almost like a message left for people who were patient enough to look. In the collections of several European museums, carefully preserved under controlled conditions of temperature and humidity, there are objects that belong to the Dark Ages. Not grand monuments, not famous works of art. Small things, personal things. A comb carved from bone, its teeth worn with use. A bronze pin for fastening a cloak, its surface still showing the traces of a decorative pattern. A child's shoe, preserved by accident in waterlogged soil, still shaped by the foot it once held. These objects were made for use. They were not made to be preserved. They were not made to end up in museums 1500 years later, under the eyes of people whose world their makers could not have imagined. They were made because someone needed a comb, because someone's cloak needed fastening, because a child needed shoes. And that need, that ordinary, unhistoric, completely human need, is the thing that persists across all the silence. The Dark Ages cannot silence that. The absence of records cannot erase it. Even the total loss of a culture's written output cannot change the fact that people were here, and they needed things, and they made things, and they wore them out, and sometimes those things survived long enough to end up in a museum. This is the deepest continuity. Not language, not law, not religion, not even memory, but the simple fact of human need. The need to eat and sleep and keep warm. The need to take care of children. The need to be in community with other people. The need, more mysterious than any of the others, to make things beautiful even when beauty is not strictly necessary. To carve a pattern on a pin when a plain pin would serve equally well. To shape a comb with care even though no one will see the work but the person using it. That need does not go dark. It cannot be recorded, exactly, but it also cannot be lost. It shows up in the archaeology. In the careful workmanship of everyday objects made in the most difficult years of the most difficult centuries. In the illuminated manuscripts produced by monks who could have simply copied the texts in plain script. In the grave goods placed with the dead by communities that had very little to spare. The Dark Ages were dark in many ways. In population, in institutional complexity, in the volume of documentation, in the reach of trade and the frequency of contact with the wider world. In all these dimensions, the period represented a contraction, a pulling in, a reduction. But in the dimension of humanness, of the fundamental impulse to be alive and to make something of it, the Dark Ages were not dark at all. They burned with the same fire that every age burns with, the same fire that you carry in you right now, that you have carried through whatever difficulties brought you to this moment, that will carry you through whatever comes next. That fire is older than Rome. It is older than agriculture. It is as old as the first human who looked at the world and felt the complex mixture of wonder and anxiety and hope and determination that is the specific human response to being alive. The Dark Ages did not put it out. Nothing has ever put it out, and nothing will. Sleep now. The fire is still burning. It will be there when you wake. It always has been. And if this quiet walk through the centuries helped you feel something, some connection to the long chain of people who came before you, some peace in the thought that the darkness has always had company and the fire has never gone out, then it did what it was meant to do. Somewhere tonight, someone is listening to this in a city whose foundations rest on Roman ruins. Someone else is listening in a country whose language was shaped by the very fragmentation we talked about tonight. Someone is listening in a place that did not exist in the Dark Ages because it was still forest, or ocean, or ice, and now it is a house with a light and a voice in the dark. All of you, wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you are the continuation of the story. The latest chapter in a book that started a very long time ago and has no ending that we can see from here. The Dark Ages are in that book. They are part of what you are, as surely as the DNA in your cells and the language in your mouth and the particular way you understand the world. You carry them. They are yours. Along with everything else that has ever made a human being. Rest well. The story goes on. It always has. It always will. There is something that historians rarely say out loud, because it sounds too close to sentiment, too far from the careful neutrality that scholarship demands. But it is worth saying here, in the quiet of this late hour, when the defences are down and the analytical mind is beginning to soften towards sleep, the people of the Dark Ages were brave. Not in the cinematic sense, not in the sense of charging into battle or making grand speeches before assembled crowds, but in the quieter, harder, more sustaining sense of getting up every morning into a world that offered very little certainty and doing what needed to be done anyway. Think about what it meant to be a farmer in post-Roman Britain in the year 500. You had no way of knowing whether the harvest would be good or bad. You had no way of knowing whether raiders would come before the grain could be stored. You had no way of knowing whether the winter would be mild or brutal, whether your children would survive the inevitable illnesses of the cold months, whether the people you depended on would still be there in the spring. You had no written records to consult, no broader context to place your experience in, no way of knowing whether what you were going through was exceptional or ordinary by the standards of any wider world. You just had the field in front of you and the season turning above you and the people around you and the work that needed doing, and you did it. Day after day, season after season, year after year. Not because you were resigned to suffering, not because you lacked the imagination to want something different, but because the work was real and the people who depended on it were real, and the alternative to doing it was worse. That is a kind of courage that does not make it into chronicles. It does not generate the kind of record that historians can work with. It leaves only the indirect trace of its own continuation, the fact that communities persisted, that children were raised, that the thread held. But it was real. It was happening constantly across the entire period we call the Dark Ages. In every village and every monastery and every royal hall and every campsite of every wandering group that left no name in any document, the courage of ordinary persistence, the bravery of getting up again, we owe those people more than we usually acknowledge. Not in any practical sense. There is nothing we can do for them now, but in the sense of recognition, in the sense of understanding that the world we live in, with all its comforts and its documentation and its relative security, was built on the backs of people who had none of those things and who kept going anyway. The Dark Ages deserve that recognition. Not as a period of heroic suffering, not as a cautionary tale, not as a prelude to better things, but as a time when millions of people lived their lives with as much dignity and creativity and love as their circumstances allowed, and sometimes more. That is the final word the silence offers, if you listen for it. Not a warning and not a lesson, just a recognition. They were here. They were real. They mattered, to themselves and to each other, even when no one was writing it down. As you drift now towards sleep, carry that with you. The warmth of it, the company of all those unnamed, unrecorded, absolutely real people who made it through their own dark ages and handed the thread forward to the next generation and the next and the next, all the way to you, here, now, in whatever corner of the world you are resting in tonight. The thread is in your hands. It has always been in your hands. Sleep. You are part of the story. The silence was never empty. It was full of breathing, full of hearts beating in the dark, full of people who did not know they were living through history, because no one ever does. They were just living. And that, in the end, is enough. And somewhere out there tonight, under the same stars that watched over every monastery and every ruined forum and every campfire of the Dark Ages, someone else is also drifting off, connected to you by nothing more than the shared fact of being alive. That connection is older than any empire. It survived every darkness. It is surviving this one too.